Today's workshop is on the theme of emotional sobriety, and the title is Practical Honesty. Willingness, honesty, and an open-mindedness are the essentials of recovery. So states Bill Wilson in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. What does it mean to be truly honest? To embrace honesty not just as a principle, an ideal, but as a practice, a way of life. Our speaker today is Zoë Kors, author of the critically acclaimed book, Radical Intimacy. Zoë will explain the difference between honesty, truth, and integrity, and how each serve our recovery. Zoë will also share practical steps and tools for enforcing boundaries with kindness, how saying no can be an act of love, and finally, why you need to be honest, not only with others, but with yourself. I'll post details about Zoë in the chat also. And this is the second of a series of 7 workshops that Zoë has very generously and kindly offered to put on for our group. And we couldn't thank you more, Zoë. It's been great to meet you, and great that you, we're so happy that you signed up to do this, and so appreciative. I want you to know that. And I'll now turn it over to you, Zoë. It's wonderful to see you again.
Thank you so much, Patrick. It's such a joy to be here, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be of service in this way. So thank you. Hi, everybody. I set these topics myself, and I was sitting with this talk coming up in this last several days and thinking about honesty, and in service of honesty here, I'll tell you that I was a little bit overwhelmed by the idea of what honesty really means, and all of the nuances. It really is sort of the underpinning of so many things. So the first thing that came to mind was when I was a little girl growing up in New York in the late 1960s, just about my favorite thing in the world was I Love Lucy. And we had a black and white TV, and I would, my mom would make me a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and I would camp out in the living room and turn the TV on black and white, which hardly mattered because I Love Lucy is black and white. And I will never forget the episode where Ricky and Fred and Ethel all challenge Lucy to tell the truth, to be honest for 24 hours. And they tell her up front, like, there's no way you can do this. There's no way you can not lie, even white lies for 24 hours. And so the remainder of the episode is Lucy telling the truth, Lucy being honest. And I don't know if any of you are I Love Lucy fans, but she goes to play bridge at her friend Carolyn Appleby, who's a recurring character. She goes to play bridge at Carolyn Appleby's house. And Carolyn has gotten rid of, she's redecorated her home, and she's, as she says, she's gotten rid of all of the early American furniture and decor, and she's replaced it with Chinese modern. And so Lucy reveals to Ethel when Carolyn leaves the room that it's awful, that she doesn't like it, right? And Ethel takes the opportunity to question Lucy and force her into telling the truth. So she tells Carolyn Appleby that the furniture is looks like something like a bad dream after eating too much Chinese food. And from there, the episode goes on. She tells another woman who has this very uproarious laugh that to stop cackling, that they've been waiting for years for her to lay that egg. And so it goes on from there, and eventually Lucy actually passes the test, or they let her off the hook, and everybody's happy. So very funny episode. And also it really planted a seed in me, as I'm sure everybody, it's kind of a big cultural narrative that the message to glean from that episode is that being honest hurts people, right? the idea is reinforced all over the place in a kind of pervasive cultural narrative that the truth hurts. And we say things like the bitter truth, you know? And so we learn to not be honest. We learn that our honesty is dangerous, that it makes people feel bad, it makes people uncomfortable. And so, you know, I've been thinking a lot. There are other ideas about honesty and what honesty really is, right? And it's a big concept. I chose the topic, you know, as I was sort of mapping out 7 things that I feel I can contribute to in a thoughtful way. But, you know, I chose honesty because it's a big intrinsic part of the program. In fact, rigorous honesty are the words that Bill uses. And the word honesty is printed 19 times in the big book. I have not verified that, but I saw that little statistic on the internet in Googling honesty and the program. So if I'm incorrect in that, somebody will put it in the chat. But as far as I know, it's mentioned 19 times in the big book. So in recovery, we tend to see 2 kinds of people, right? The person who wants to recover and will be rigorously honest, as we say, with themselves and others. And then there's also the person who, even though they want recovery, they want to be sober, they don't yet have the capacity to be truly honest with themselves. And they bump up against that unwillingness in various forms, and it interferes with their full recovery. The importance of honesty in recovery is one of the fundamental keystones to overcoming addiction. It takes honesty to accept and understand that you really have a problem. It takes honesty to see that you've lost your power to control the amount of alcohol or drugs that you put in your body, or the extent to which you act out in compulsive behaviors. It also takes honesty to be able to walk into a room and tell your story. And of course, it takes rigorous honesty to be right in your relationships with the people in your life. So this idea that honesty hurts people and is dangerous, we learn early on not to make waves, to fly under the radar, not to make a scene, not to make anyone uncomfortable. And so we limit ourselves. We make ourselves small so that people will like us. They'll feel at ease around us. We don't even think of this necessarily as being honest, but at the same time, we learn how not to express ourselves authentically. Eventually, we lose touch with ourselves deep down and the essence of who we are. And so we live a little bit of a lie, a half-truth. We're not totally honest with ourselves and in the way that we interact with people. Over the years of observing myself and my loved ones and my clients, I've come to understand the 3 core ways in which we avoid feeling the discomfort of the truth of our emotions. So we're talking about emotional sobriety. So part of that is really being able to feel our emotions and to be with our emotions and the truth of what's actually happening inside of us, right? So when we avoid that, there are these 3 ways that I really have sort of extracted and defined that I call the trifecta of anti-intimacy. But it could just as easily be called the trifecta of anti-honesty. And those are denial, deflection, and distraction. All right, so as I read these descriptions of denial, deflection, and distraction, think about how these live in your own life. We all do these to some extent or another. They don't need to be big, epic ways in which we're fooling ourselves. These are actually can be subtleties as well. So denial, pretending there isn't a problem at all. We convince ourselves and others that everything is A-okay. Living in denial of emotional pain causes cognitive dissonance telling ourselves that what we feel doesn't really exist. It's a lot like gaslighting ourselves. Gaslighting is a word that is used to describe the manipulative behavior of narcissists who systematically disable the people close to them by invalidating their experience. It comes from the movie Gaslighting, where the husband, maybe you've all seen this movie, but the husband in Gaslighting slowly dims the gas lights in the home, and then tells his wife, who thinks she's going crazy, that they're not actually getting dimmer. And so he's manipulating her to lose trust in herself, to not believe what she's actually experiencing by telling her it isn't so, it isn't happening. So this idea that we deny our experience is a little bit like gaslighting ourselves. So those being gaslit will often ask themselves, like, am I crazy? As they try to figure out why their internal navigation system doesn't match their external reality. When we deny our own feelings, we are both the abuser and the abused. We alienate our cognitive selves from our emotional selves, right? The thinking brain and the feeling heart are at odds with each other. We disconnect from our intuition, losing trust in ourselves and our ability to accurately discern what's real. So it's easy to see how there's a lack of honesty there when you're not honest with yourself and the people around you about how you feel, what your experience is. Another component of the trifecta of anti-honesty, for the purposes of this talk, is deflection. When we're unwilling to take responsibility for our own experience and we direct our pain at someone or something else. In deflecting, our original emotion often gets distorted past recognition, making it hard to track what's actually happening, right? So maybe you've had the experience of, like, I feel guilty about something. I've done something that I'm not proud of and I'm not happy about it. But yet I twist the conversation into how I was wronged, how I'm the victim of something or somebody's behavior, right? Or I had a client whose husband, they were married for 30 some years, and her husband, she discovers, had an affair with a woman at work. And she was more angry at the woman who he had the affair with than at her husband for his behavior and his choice to go outside the marriage and betray her. And when I dug around and questioned her and worked through it with her, it was much harder for her, much more painful for her to admit that her husband chose somebody else over her. It brought up all kinds of feelings, as you can imagine, appropriately so, about her own worthiness, about why he would choose somebody else, about issues in their marriage that had gone unaddressed for many, many years. It was a lot to work through. It was much easier for her to deflect from that pain and that painful process to be angry at the woman who he had an affair with, as if she coerced him. She brainwashed him. She even used those words. My husband was brainwashed. And so that deflection left a good piece of her inner work undone until we dug through it and processed and then, met there to in that tender work. So there's a lack of honesty there. The third piece is distraction. In order not to feel pain, we often distract ourselves. I know we're all in this room. We are all very familiar with distraction. Distracting ourselves with things that are inherently unhealthy, like eating, drinking, sex, shopping, or other compulsive behaviors. However, this isn't always the case. Sometimes we allocate an abundance of resources like time and energy towards the wonderful and nourishing areas of our lives, to an extent that prevents deep healing work and the disruption and discomfort that it brings. So you'll see this kind of distraction take the form of a workaholic, an exercise fanatic, or a mother who's so obsessed with her child that she sacrifices all of her needs and forfeits a life of her own, right? Distractions can appear destructive or be disguised as benevolent attributes. The distinction is often in the subtleties. So that's something to be aware of. So those are the three areas that I really see most commonly people hiding out from the truth, hiding out from their feelings, not willing to face these feelings and work through them and accept them and embrace them and understand them, right? And then by suppressing that, we act out in ways that are, often those pieces of us that we don't want to face, they come out sideways. So real honesty, let's define what real honesty really is. It means being willing to see things as they are without having any motive or intention to change them. Just being with what is, right? There's a level of honesty, intimacy, transparency with yourself when you're able to just be with what is, no matter how uncomfortable. So say you have an experience, a moment of jealousy. Say you're at a party. Let's really play this out. So you have an experience of jealousy at a party that you're at with a partner. Being honest about this means that you must not disregard that jealous feeling. You actually have to be with the jealousy and admit to it. Being honest is to be curious, right? So be with it, investigate it, feel it, know it, understand it, and embrace it as information, as a teacher, right? Oh, isn't that interesting? I feel jealous. Right. And I see many people in my practice as we start to unwind these things, instead of reacting to the discomfort of the jealousy by lashing out, you did something wrong, you behaved badly, you're wrong and bad. Real honesty means you sit with those thoughts and get curious. And that looks like maybe something like this. The internal dialogue as you sit and process is, what makes me think this person is wrong or bad? Maybe the answer is because I was disrespected. They disrespected me. And the story I tell myself about that is that I don't matter, which makes me feel invisible and lonely. And it reminds me of feeling abandoned and scared as a kid. Right? When you take yourself on that journey, now, instead of saying to your partner, I'm angry because you behave badly, you're able to say, I notice I'm having a reaction to your behavior. I feel jealous because on some level, I'm afraid I'll lose you. It's a much more honest communication, right? And actually more effective. The willingness to be honest with yourself, to sit with your feelings, to inquire with yourself, what is driving the pain and suffering and the expression, and to bring that. I'm inclined to ask you, but I can only see a portion of you on the screen. I'm inclined to ask you, if you identify with the story at all, like the acting and the saying and the speaking from a point of like unconscious pain where we feel a little bit victimized, right? And to really take a look at that and go deep and dig deep and say, what's underneath this? Why am I so angry? And what piece of this can I own? Right? That's emotional sobriety. That's skill. That's honesty. So if you have a pen, you can always look at this again on the on the recording, but if you have a pen, I'm going to give you 6 practical steps to get honest with yourself. Right? The first one, what am I about to say or do? So you feel activated, right? You feel a little bit dysregulated. If you know that term, if any of you have dealt with any kind of trauma treatment, dysregulation is when you feel not in control of what's happening. You feel anxious, your heart speeds up, you feel angry or lightheaded, right? You have a visceral response of something going on, some kind of dysregulation or reaction. You may often identify that as anger. That's often a sort of unskilled recognition lumps that into anger, and that's perfectly fine. Anger is a great messenger to let you know that some boundary has been crossed or something has been triggered in you, right? That makes you say, whoa, wait, I need to protect myself. So what am I about to say or do when you're feeling that, when you recognize that there's something happening for you, you're feeling something? What am I about to say or do? What are my thoughts is number 2. What am I thinking? There's no right or wrong. It's just information. You know, that might look like my partner's a jerk. My partner's wrong. How could my partner do that to me? They should have known better. What are they thinking? Those are the thoughts. And then what are you making that mean? The third step is ask yourself, what are my beliefs about this? Another way of saying that is, what am I making this mean? The story I'm creating around that. What I'm telling myself is, you don't care about me. You're disrespecting me. I don't matter to you. You know, there are a million different things that you could be believing as a result of what you're thinking, right? And then underneath that, what are my emotions? What are my emotions about this? I'm angry, and I'm feeling vulnerable underneath that anger. I'm afraid. 9 times out of 10, what's happening here is fear. So what are my emotions? And then number 5 is, why do I feel this way? If you're a fan of Gabor Mate, you will know that we've all been traumatized to some extent. And trauma doesn't necessarily mean a big knowable, severe injury or event. It can be, but each of us have small traumas, and people use the word now, the term big T trauma or small T trauma. There are big T traumas, which can be a big nameable event, or an ongoing chronic abuse or violation of some kind that has a different sort of impact over the long haul. But then there are small T traumas too, which are no less impactful. It's a different kind of impact. And sometimes those small T traumas are sneaky. And what doesn't seem to have a big impact or cause a lot of harm in the moment can really stay with you. I can remember things that, you know, old partners said to me, or that my parents said to me, that really stayed in me and shaped the way I feel about myself or interact with the world, right? So that's something to be mindful of. It doesn't have to feel like a giant event. So why do I feel this way? Maybe it was part of a past trauma. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it's fear of abandonment. Maybe it's fear of rejection or not belonging or the loss of something. And then the last step is to think to yourself, if I were whole and healthy, what would I say? What actions would I take? You might even say, if I were whole and healthy, what would my thoughts be? What would my beliefs be? What would my emotions likely be? Right? And to really play that. Look, we're masters of comparison, and I could have a talk on comparing yourself to other people and how not to do that, and it's not helpful. It's human nature. And sometimes, actually, in the right circumstances, the comparison is actually a healthy and empowering thing. So to use that to your advantage in number 6, if I were whole and healthy, what would this experience be like for me? You may or may not be able to access the answers to that step. One of the things that I see often is this idea of like, what would Jesus do? Or what would Buddha do? Or you could substitute whoever is a teacher for you, or whoever is a sort of a moral guidepost for you. What would the Dalai Lama do? Or there was a point where I used to say, what would Meryl Streep do? What would Meryl do? She was my pinnacle of ethics and values. So you can substitute that, right? And that's a great thing. Like, what would my role model do in this situation? Would they feel angry at my partner, watching my partner get punched with someone else? Probably not. They probably wouldn't be fazed by it, right? So try that on and use that to further define what's happening for you and where you're going with this as you learn to be more and more honest and more recovered and more emotionally sober, right? So one of the pieces that's super important in honesty, like a sort of practical expression of honesty and self-awareness, is our boundaries. Boundaries are a huge part of being honest. And it can be really challenging to establish and then enforce boundaries. Again, this goes to like this idea that our honesty is harmful to people, that it hurts people, or that, saying no. I had a client say to me the other day, I believe on some level, like on a cellular level, that saying no or setting a boundary is mean. Setting boundaries, she said to me, boundaries are mean. I'm like, yeah, that's an interesting belief system, and I want to know more. So we talked about her history of that, and of course it goes back to childhood. If it's not one thing, it's your mother. And so we worked through like where that belief system came from and how that lives out in its many ways in her life now. And of course, it's extremely problematic. So there are 4 kinds of boundaries that I think are important. To think about it in this way helps to understand where to look in your life and your inner well-being, where these 4 kinds of boundaries stand. One is physical boundaries. Right? Physical boundaries are the easiest to recognize, right? It's where you end and someone else begins, basically. That's literally what a boundary is. So when you think of physical boundaries, right, only you are entitled to your body and your space and your belongings, right? That's your birthright. Like, nobody has the right to come near you, to touch you, to touch your stuff. So, this is particularly tricky if you have experienced and struggled with abuse, and violation in that way, but all the more important to work through this. It's essential that you set physical boundaries for yourself and to communicate to those around you. Your physical boundaries may be simple, such as telling loved ones not to touch a recovery journal that you've been keeping or a special book of yours. It also might be more complex, like removing triggers from your home or not wanting to be touched, not wanting to hug or to step away, to take that sort of physical space that you need. Emotional boundaries. Emotional boundaries is the ability to distinguish between your own emotional state and that of another, right? The antithesis of codependency. One of the most confusing relational dynamics is the sorting of emotions when boundaries have been collapsed and everyone is feeling everything. When you are well boundaried emotionally, you know where you end and someone else begins. That means you can properly allocate the emotional resources to manage your own experiences or support someone else in doing so. Right? If someone feels jealous, get curious. You don't have to take that on. You don't have to feel guilty in response to their jealousy. Right? You have two independent emotional landscapes. Recognize that and protect yours so that you can see clearly what's yours and what's not yours. I in therapy, we like to say that, like, if someone is feeling something in the room and they're not taking ownership of it, then everyone feels it. So you're bringing your anger or your grief or your sadness and you're in denial of it and you're a victim and you're handing it to whoever else is in the room, whether it's your partner or your mother or your friend or your kids or whoever. You're basically saying, like, I'm not recognizing my anger, although everybody can feel it. So here, I think of it as one of those big black leaf bags, garbage bags, leaf bags of like crap. Here, take my crap because I'm not going to take responsibility for it. Okay, time boundaries. Time boundaries is the third. You don't have to be struggling with addiction or in recovery to have the experience of violating your time boundaries. As an entrepreneur, I do this all the time. I do it all the time. It's like a chronic condition that I have to be mindful of and be aware of and manage, right? If I had diabetes, I would be managing blood sugar. I'm a human being and a busy human being that wants to do so many things, participate in so many things, help so many people. And I still have a teenager at home who I love very much and love spending time with and supporting. So I and a husband and a 92-year-old mother, right? So I have to be ruthless in my time boundaries because there are only 24 hours in a day. And I need to take care of myself and the people in my life. And that includes everybody and my home and my dogs, right? So I have to be able to split up my 24 hours in a way that really serves not just me, but the people in my life. It doesn't serve anybody for me to run myself ragged. Believe me, I've tried. I've tried hard. I've gotten myself into this situation many, many, many times where I'm just so overextended that everyone suffers. I start dropping balls all over the place. No bueno. It's not good. And so I have to remind myself that when I say to a client who's in crisis, I'm so sorry, I'm booked today, but I can get on a call with you at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning. Can you make it through the night? You know, that's the kind of thing that I have to be able to say. And it's not easy. So time boundaries are a big one. And then finally, one of the ones that is hardest to talk about are internal boundaries. And it's probably, I'm guessing, one of the areas that most of us in this room have really struggled with. Internal boundaries are the boundaries that you set with yourself according to your values and capacities, right? If we have strong internal boundaries, we're aware of our morals and values and avoid people and situations that force us out of alignment with them. Internal boundaries also respect our personal limits. They enable us to remove ourselves from triggering environments and make decisions that serve our recovery and our general well-being. Internal boundaries also include taking accountability for yourself. This level of self-awareness means that you understand how you interact and react within a situation. So it's about being honest with yourself, understanding what you want for yourself, and then putting yourself in situations and around people who support that, who are in alignment with that. And that might mean, you know, when you're well boundaried, when you have good internal boundaries, it might mean that you complete some friendships, right? It might mean that when there's a friendship that you don't want to complete, like, you know, I grew up with a mother who was completely enmeshed with me emotionally. And I really couldn't tolerate being in relationship with her as an adult the way that I was when I was a teenager. And so I didn't want to complete that relationship. I wanted my mother in my life, but it took I had to be a very sharp steward of my internal boundaries and show up differently in the relationship with her. Boy, it was one of the hardest things I did, but I really reinvented my relationship with her from my half of it. And it was miraculous because when I did it, when I started to show up differently, well, what do you think? She did too. She showed up differently. And she reacted to me differently. And so by me, really, you could, from a psychological standpoint, you could say that I individuated from her. That as a teenager, I wasn't really in a position, I wasn't sort of permitted, or my own internal programming and sort of emotional landscape didn't allow me to really properly individuate from her. So when I was in my 20s, late 20s, really, what I did was I individuated from her, and she really had no choice but to follow. And it actually made her feel healthier as well. For me not to participate in that codependency made her feel whole and more sovereign in herself, and less worried about me and trying to control me to keep me safe, which is basically the essence of that mother-daughter relationship. So we were able to really relate to each other in a new way, thanks to those internal boundaries that I set for myself and then lovingly enforced, right? So boundaries are an essential form of self-care. To set a boundary and lovingly enforce it requires self-awareness and a willingness to be with what is. Willingness, right? A willingness to be with what is exactly as it is without trying to fix anything. The most important thing is your sobriety, your recovery, your wellness. All boundaries exist in service of that. In fiercely guarding your sobriety, you enforce your boundaries impeccably. It becomes easier to say no when your life is at stake. So I'm going to leave you today. I mean, I'll stick around for a whole bunch of Q&A and open discussion, but I'm going to leave you with a profound piece by the great poet David White, who you might be familiar with. I'm a big fan of his. And he wrote a piece called Honesty. Honesty is reached by the doorway of grief and loss, where we cannot go in our mind, our memory, our body is where we cannot be straight with another. Our world, ourself. The fear of loss in one form or another is the motivator behind all consciousness and unconsciousness. All of us are born to be afraid of loss in all its forms. All of us at times are haunted by or overwhelmed even by the possibility of disappearance. And all of us, therefore, are but one short step from dishonesty. Every human being dwells intimately close to a door of revelation that they are afraid to pass through. Honesty lies in understanding our close and necessary relationship with not wanting to hear the truth. Our ability to speak the truth is as much the ability to describe what it is like to stand in trepidation at this door, as it is to actually go through it and become that beautifully honest spiritual warrior, equal to all circumstances we want to become. Honesty is not the revealing of some foundational truth that gives us power over life or another, or even the self, but a robust incarnation into the unknown, unfolding vulnerability of existence. I'm going to read that again. It's so powerful. The ability to speak the truth is as much the ability to describe what it is like to stand in trepidation at this door, as it is to actually go through it and become that beautifully honest spiritual warrior, equal to all circumstances we want to become. Honesty is not the revealing of some foundational truth that gives us power over life or another, or even the self, but a robust incarnation into the unknown, unfolding vulnerability of existence, where we acknowledge how powerless we feel, how little we actually know, how afraid we are of not knowing, and how astonished we are by the generous measure of loss that is conferred upon even the most average life. Honesty is grounded in humility and indeed in humiliation, and in admitting exactly where we are powerless. Honesty is not found in revealing the truth, but in understanding how deeply afraid of it we are. To become honest is, in effect, to become fully and robustly incarnated into powerlessness. Honesty allows us to live with not knowing. We do not know the full story. We do not know where we are in the story. We do not know who ultimately is at fault or who will carry the blame in the end. Honesty is not protection. Honesty is not a weapon to keep loss and heartbreak at bay. Honesty is the outer diagnostic of our ability to come to ground in reality, the hardest attainable ground of all, the place where we actually dwell, the living, breathing frontier where we are given no choice between gain or loss.